I know we have some people in already, and I'm sure more will come. Thank you for bearing with some of our technical questions with the screen sharing. But we're really glad that you're all here for today's program. I think it's going to be really great. My name is Shayla, and I serve as the programs manager for the DC Preservation League. And Zachary Burt is going to be helping me. He can start the Facebook live streaming as well. So I'm joined by him, and then I'm also joined by individuals who were with the Walter Pierce Park Archaeology and Commemoration Project. And for those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are Washington, D.C.'s citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. I have a few things to go over before we get started, and I'm going to take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one today. So we have the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, QTech Rock, Douglas Development Corporations, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Robert Benson Photography, Bayer Blunder Bell, Building Innovation Hub, Edens, EHT Traceries Inc., KCE Structural Engineers, Quinn Evans, and David Schwartz Architects. Thank you all for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. And we are now also live on Facebook, so if anybody's joining us there, hello. We have a few fabulous speakers to hear from today, so if you have a question, please use the Q&A box. It's at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go through all of your questions and comments at the end of the webinar. For those joining us on Facebook, Zach will be monitoring your questions as well, so if you have those, you can send them to him or comment on Facebook, and we'll put them in here on Zoom. And so now that we've covered kind of all of our housekeeping items, I'm so pleased to introduce you all to today's speakers, each of whom has been involved in the Walter Pierce Park Archaeology and Commemoration Project. Mary Belcher is a community activist and local historian. She has been a part of the Walter Pierce Park Archaeology and Commemoration Project since its inception in 2005. A visual artist and former journalist, she helps organize public events to raise awareness of the cemeteries. Dr. Shayla Monroe is currently working as a postdoctoral scholar in the Mediterranean Prehistory and Paleoecology Laboratory at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Dr. Monroe worked with the Howard University Archaeology team to excavate and look at areas of the park. Andre Ferrell is a descendant of Philip and Clara Johnson, both of whom were buried at Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery in Walter Pierce Park. The Johnsons came to Washington from Virginia during the Civil War and lived near 17th and P Streets Northwest. With that, I'm excited to turn things over to our speakers. Thank all of you for being here today. And Mary, if you want to share your screen, I will stop sharing mine.
Okay, thank you very much, Shay. Hope this works, guys. Okay, I'll be focusing on the African American cemetery at Walter Pierce Park. And I'll tell you about the men who established it, who was buried there, how it almost disappeared, and whether our Grassroots project has actually saved it, as the title of this talk implies. Let's see, I want to advance my screen. There we go. Walter Pierce Park in Adams Morgan sits behind a bus turnaround in Calvert Street row houses just east of the Duke Ellington Bridge over Rock Creek. And this park is many things to many people. It's a ball field, a playground, basketball courts, dog park, a place to sit in the sun. It's also two cemeteries, a quarter-acre Quaker cemetery founded in 1807, and the 6.75-acre Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery, where more than 8,428 people were buried between 1870 and 1890. Scientists recently determined that hundreds and possibly thousands of graves still exist at Walter Pierce Park, 132 years after the last burial took place, which raises the question, when does a cemetery stop being a cemetery? And a less Zen-like question is, how did Washington, D.C.'s busiest Reconstruction era Black cemetery nearly disappear? The story of Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery begins in the parlor of a downtown house where a small group of free African American men met in the fall of 1838. And at that gathering, they agreed to unite and form themselves together as one body for the mutual benefit of each other. And that agreement, their pact, would endure for more than 60 years. They named themselves the Free Young Men's Benevolent Association. And they pooled their resources with initiation fees and monthly dues. And in return, they got sick pay, loans with interest, and burial benefits. Their meetings, which were held the first Wednesday of each month, were private. And after opening with a hymn and a prayer, they got down to business quickly. They reviewed finances, reported on members' needs, and vetted new applicants. About 77 men came and went through the association over the 6 decades that it was active, and many were related by birth or marriage. The main criterion for membership was that a man be free. Some came by their freedom by being born free to free mothers. Some were freed voluntarily by their enslavers. Some negotiated deals with their enslavers to buy their freedom. In their day jobs, they were laborers, coach drivers, servants, merchants, government messengers. In their personal time, they were activists with a capital A, as you can see from this slide. They and their families helped found many of the district's earliest Black churches and schools. They laid the groundwork to support a robust African American community in the middle of a slaveholding city, which is our Washington, D.C. And association members sometimes worked secretly to free enslaved people. In 1848, they were involved in the largest underground railroad operation in history, which was the escape of more than 70 enslaved Washingtonians on the schooner Pearl, which was to leave the 7th Street Wharf, go down the Potomac, and up to Chesapeake Bay 2 points north. But the escape failed, and it was a personal tragedy for association members, many of whom had family and friends on the Pearl. Some of the members had even helped execute the operation. Although the group provided benefits to its members since 1838, they didn't own their own cemetery until 1849, when it bought a city square at 12th and B Streets Northwest for the Free Young Men's burial ground. They sold plots to the public, and that enriched the group's coffers. And I'll fast forward quickly through the story of this cemetery because that's not the topic today. In 1865, the Free Young Men changed their name to the Colored Union Benevolent Association and received a charter. And a few years later, the city began restricting new cemeteries in the central part of the district, so many moved to the district's rural outskirts. In 1870, the association bought 6.75 acres of land for a new burial ground from the heirs of John Quincy Adams, who had owned a mill just above the cemetery site on Rock Creek. They named the new ground Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery, and it abutted the city's only Quaker cemetery, which was much smaller and older, and it was founded in 1807. This is a picture of the contour map of the two cemeteries. It was a gently sloping terrain at that point. At least 8,428 people were buried at Mount Pleasant Plains. As you can see, more than half of them were children under the age of 5. Of the adults, most came from Virginia and Maryland, including countless self-emancipated refugees of the Civil War. The burials included at least 45 soldiers and sailors, pastors, musicians, victims of violence, the first African American men to vote, people who witnessed the events surrounding President Lincoln's assassination and later testified at the assassination trials. They were really just ordinary people who lived in extraordinary times. Mount Pleasant Plains became the busiest Black Reconstruction era cemetery in Washington. Some funerals were grand events with brass bands, horse-drawn carriages, and hundreds of mourners. Others were simple, with the city covering the burial costs. Graves were marked with painted wooden headboards, but some had expensive granite monuments. Children's graves were piled with toys. Mounds of seashells, broken ceramics, and other objects covered other burial spots. And there was a vault, there was fencing, a custodian's cottage, and a paved road through the cemetery. So how did all this, a cemetery with more than 8,000 graves, almost disappear? In 1889, association members were caught off guard by an inquiry from men scouting land for a new national zoo. What was the best price at which they would sell their cemetery? The association voted not to answer, but the pressure built. The association continued to refuse to make a deal. Then a group of neighbors, led by an important Smithsonian scientist, did an end run on the association. The neighbors petitioned the city health department to close the cemetery. The city agreed, and new burials were prohibited at Mount Pleasant Plains after, after June 1890. That year, zoo planners decided they really only wanted 1.8 acres of the 7-acre cemetery, and the federal government condemned it so that it could be purchased. The closing of the cemetery caused the association to suspend member benefits immediately. By 1913, the last surviving trustee, Charles H. Shorter, sought and posthumously won a court ruling to respectfully disinter and remove the graves and move them elsewhere so that the cemetery land could be sold. Unfortunately, attempts to locate and move the graves failed miserably. There was an exploratory dig of 300 holes, and in those holes, there were only 129 full and partial sets of remains. They also found 13 headstones when they were trying to clear the cemetery. Nevertheless, the land was sold in parcels over the next few decades, and it should surprise no one listening that private developers got hold of most of the Black Cemetery. The same developers acquired the adjoining Quaker cemetery in a shady tax sale. The developers wanted to build 4 large apartment buildings at the site with underground parking. In the 1950s, as they were leveling the site, an unknown number of graves were destroyed by developers' steam shovels under the eyes of city health officials. The buildings were never built. The vacant lot became a people's park. Neighborhood activist Walter Pierce, Councilman Frank Smith, and others worked for years to persuade Congress to buy the land for a city park. They succeeded, but when the park was built in the early 1980s, more ground was moved and more graves were desecrated. You might think, great, the cemetery became a park. It didn't get paved over or built on, like so many other old cemeteries. But parks really aren't static landscapes. In 2005, the city planned to build several large, deep-footed concrete walled terraces for community gardening on the north hillside of the park. That planned project ran into a group of noisy, history-minded neighbors, including me. We knew almost nothing about the Black and Quaker cemeteries at the site. All we really knew was that the cemeteries were shown on old maps, and that park users in a few instances had found coffin handles and other cemetery relics. I cold called the anthropology department at Howard University, and Mark Mack, a biological anthropologist, picked up the phone. He had been one of the lead scientists on the landmark African Burial Ground project in New York. And then that was another thing I didn't know right then. But Professor Mack immediately agreed to help us. So we asked the city to allow Professor Mack and a team of Howard students to conduct a careful archaeological study of the site to make sure the planned construction project didn't destroy any graves that might remain. City officials told us they didn't need our help. In a series of very heated public meetings over the next 9 months, they insisted that all the graves had been removed. Long, long ago, they said. But those officials, it turned out, were as ignorant as we were about the facts of the cemeteries. Then we, the concerned folks, found a newspaper article from 1889 that shed greater light on the matter. The article stated that there had been 4,757 burials at the cemetery in the previous 10 years. Because the cemetery had operated for 20 years, the actual number, of course, was much higher. In other words, this hadn't been some quaint cemetery with a few hundred graves hidden behind bushes along a back road. This had been a major urban burial ground in its 20-year existence. I'm not sure if this article or these facts turned the tide, but the city finally agreed to let Mark Mack's Howard team survey the site. A non-invasive survey was conducted from 2006 to 2012, first with private donations and grants and later with city funding. Dr. Shayla Monroe will tell you about the archaeological work. One part of the work that I was involved in was researching the people who had been buried there. We compiled a database of names, addresses, and other information about the people buried at Mount Pleasant Plains. We didn't have a book of interments, of course, so we hand searched more than 75,000 DC death certificates and earlier records to call out 8,428 names. The database, which is published on our website, helps descendants find their ancestors at Walter Pierce Park. And you'll hear shortly from Andre Ferrell, who is one of those descendants. This is just to show you why our eyesight got worse at the DC archives. This is the death certificate of Richard Edmondson. He was one of the 6 Edmondson siblings who tried to escape enslavement on the schooner Pearl in 1848, the operation I referred to earlier. Several of his in-laws were association members. All the facts I presented today were uncovered from our work at the park, and it's available at walterpierceparkcemeteries.org. We now know that the city construction project planned in 2005 would have destroyed intact graves. Did we save the cemeteries at Walter Pierce Park? The answer is mixed. Since 2005, we've raised public awareness through walking tours and other public events. We have failed, however, to make any impression on the DC Department of Parks and Recreation, which oversees Walter Pierce Park. For example, there is no management plan to curtail invasive vegetation and to control erosion on the North Hill side of the park. And whenever DPR staffers propose changes to the park, our grassroots group seems to have to enlighten them about the presence of graves. The DC Office of Historic Preservation, to which we're grateful for overseeing our work at Walter Pierce, now requires archaeological monitoring for all construction there. But how well do DC agencies really communicate with each other? At the Parks Department, when the words Walter Pierce Park come up, is there a message that suddenly reads, stop, contact Historic Preservation Office first? I doubt it. In 2018, Descendants and Allies asked the DC Department of Parks to create a modest, non-invasive commemorative space at Walter Pierce with signage that would list the names of the buried. After many meetings, DPR promised publicly to do so, as it undertook nearly $1 million worth of improvements to the park. While the kids got a new playground and a water fountain was installed at the dog park, DPR failed to make good on its promise to us. We've had better luck with Rock Creek Park and the National Park Service. 17 years after our grassroots efforts began, we worked with Rock Creek Rangers to create the first historic signage at the park, with funding from the Park Service and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. 4 National Underground Railroad signs now stand at the Calvert Street entrance to the park on a strip of federal land. The markers honor the sacred nature of the site. They tell people passing by that this place is worth taking care of. In December 2021, descendants of the members of the Free Young Men's Benevolent Association dedicated the signs. In closing, I have one more question. It's really just rhetorical. Why should we care about Black cemeteries erased by waves of development and gentrification during the 20th century? At Walter Pierce Park is to try to repair as much as we can the damage done by the social injustices that cause erasure of cemeteries and other sites and other people. If we succeed, it's to transform a place of disconnection and forgetting into a place of reconnection and remembering. Thank you very much for your time, and I will pass it on to Shayla now.
Thank you, Mary. Let's see. I always make this so you can't get to the. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to the.
If you go to slideshow.
I know I can't get to it because the this is so odd. Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay. So this is the story of the archaeology. It's very much abridged and summarized at Walter Pierce Park. Also, I would want to acknowledge that the photographs that you see in this slideshow, most of them were taken by Mary Belcher, except where indicated. So, you know, my story kind of comes in with the student involvement. You know, this started because we had a professor, Mark Mack, who passed away in 2012. And, you know, we all became involved through Professor Mack. He was a professor in the anthropology department, very much beloved. He was kind of a character, very big personality. And he was known for being an exceptionally difficult professor and teaching an exceptionally difficult set of classes. So when I made an A in one of his exceptionally difficult classes, he offered me a job working with the Walter Pierce Park Cemetery project. And you see some pictures here of some of my classmates and I, after we became involved with the project, working with him, you know, in the evening sometimes, but mainly in the summer in terms of my involvement. So we started off with a series of surveys, and when archaeologists talk about surveys, an archaeological survey, that's just a method of mapping the physical boundaries of an archaeological site. And we record the locations of associated cultural material, and sometimes we were recording the locations of human remains, but we were also recording associated human modifications to the landscape. We call those archaeological features. So that's kind of the aim of, you know, the survey. And so there was a preliminary survey done in 2005, but then there was a pedestrian survey of the West Slope, which is this part over here, in 2006. And then I joined the project during the pedestrian survey of the North Slope in 2009. And then after that survey, there was an effort to try and plan mitigation for the soil erosion that was taking place on the west slope. And so after these surveys were completed, there was the use of ground penetrating radar. Now, this is not a picture of the graves at Walter Pierce Park. I got this from a commercial website just to explain what ground penetrating radar is and does. So this is just an example. So what happens with ground penetrating radar, it's a non-intrusive means of mapping archaeological sites that you don't want to disturb. So this machine sends signals into the ground and measures the differences in how those waves bounce back. And the variations in how those waves bounce back are recorded and visualized like you see here. And it can show you where there are burials and underground features from human activity. It was, concluded after the use of the ground penetrating radar that, hundreds or thousands of graves probably remained at the park at depths too great to be detected. So human remains were found in the park. The events leading up to the Walter Pierce Park cemetery project were set into motion partially by people actually discovering human remains that were exposed in places where the park slopes were eroding. So some of those skeletal elements were collected by volunteers before the project surveys began. Most of the bones were identified and left in situ, which means in place. Several elements remain at the W. Montague Cobb Anthropological Laboratory at Howard University, while other skeletal elements remain at the Smithsonian Museum from those previous excavations in the creation of the National Zoo. The official recommendation from the archaeological team was that both collections of remains be repatriated to the cemetery in conjunction with protective measures in place for all of the in situ remains hereafter. So as is the case with historical archaeology, the archaeological work was designed and performed in conjunction with archival and historical research. So not only did archival work provide the fundamental basis for understanding changes to the cemetery's boundaries through time and the cemetery's economic, social, and historical significance, the archives provided a fuller and richer view of the challenges that were faced by DC's early Black communities. And as we started to go through all of these death certificates, and we were really searching for people who had been buried in these associated cemeteries, but in order to do that, we had to go through almost all the deaths in DC in this community for a certain number of years. And we could see for ourselves, the documentation of some of these patterns. There were a lot of emotions involved because we could see kind of the ramifications of things like maternal mortality. Now, in the 1800s, maternal mortality was much more common across the board, across ethnicities. But one of the things we saw, or one of the things that really kind of struck me on a very personal note, was that many of the death certificates we saw, not all, but some of them were signed by physicians who had this mantle of physician to the poor. And so sometimes we would see these death certificates of women who died in childbirth. And the physicians would write notes on the back saying things like, well, I wish I could have been called earlier, or I wish someone would have contacted me, or I might have been able to, save this woman or affect the outcome if they hadn't waited so long to call. And what this made me think of on a personal note was the early relationship between these Black communities and the medical establishment. Why? didn't they trust the medical establishment? Why didn't they trust people, from outside of their communities? And so you're seeing kind of a more fully rendered set of circumstances for some of these people buried in the cemetery. And the other major patterns that we saw was childhood mortality. So going through the death certificates by date, sometimes you could see that certain alleys where people lived, or certain streets or certain city blocks, would lose 3 or 4 children to a contagious illness in a matter of days. And you can think about what that would do to a close community to lose several children at a time, and often due to preventable illness. So when you think about these emancipated people who made it to DC from all of these faraway places, it's like on one hand, they were building this powerhouse economy and they were building the city into a cultural mecca. But we could also see, written right here in the historical record, the other side of that and that struggle for survival. And so speaking of the childhood mortality, one of the things that kind of stands out about that are the grave decorations. So the historical record for childhood mortality amongst DC's Black populations provides a richer context for the fact that these children's graves were, quote unquote, elaborately decorated, according to an 1890 description of the cemetery in the Washington Post. And so the children's graves were described as being covered with like little mounds of toys and shells, broken ceramics, glass shards, and other materials. And so in this area of contagious diseases, when children of all ethnicities were vulnerable, it's very interesting to me as an archaeologist to see that the passing of these children was marked with attention and care and creativity. And I think paying attention to how people decorated these graves and marked the passing of their children gives us a little bit of an insight into the values and the worldviews of these early African American communities in DC. So here we have 2 of the most recognizable funerary artifacts that were found at Walter Pierce Park. Most of the artifacts were left in situ with the exception of a few items, and that includes this king-like figure and this stone bird, which were left in the care of W. Montague Cobb Anthropological Laboratory at Howard. So the king-like statuette was, I remember Professor Mack talking about this, and he called it a transformational figure. I wish I would have had more conversations with him about what that actually means, but this one is, it's made out of metal, and the 2 tubes he's holding in his arms are hollow, as if they could hold candles or incense. And the second item was this, stone bird that might have been made out of alabaster, but some sort of white stone. And so they were both well preserved with recognizable features. And it reminds me of archaeologist Christina Brooks, who studies African American cemeteries, argues that by studying these cemeteries in a non-invasive manner, by looking at artifacts such as this, and also the spatial arrangements of graves, we can learn more about the ideology and the spirituality of some of these early African American communities, which might have had, a good proportion of members who were non-literate. So because of that, there are stories and values and ways of knowing that are not necessarily privileged in the written record, but there are clues and hints as to how these communities saw the world, how they made sense of their world, what their spiritual world looked like. And we can kind of observe these through non-invasive observations of these cemeteries. So there were a few parallels to the New York African Burial Ground. And not the least of which is that Professor Mack worked under Michael Blakey as the head osteologist for the New York African Burial Ground project. So the New York African Burial Ground was revealed in 1991 during an archaeological survey that was in compliance for building an office building in Manhattan. And so some of the parallels that we saw, and we weren't the only ones who saw these parallels, was that the initial appeals to respect these spaces on moral or ethical grounds were simply not enough. there was, in both cases, a reluctance to treat descendants as primary or even equal stakeholders. And I have noticed that with both of these sites and with sites like these, the archaeological discourse has changed drastically in the past 10 years. As an archaeologist, being in archaeological spaces, the way people speak about these sites right now is very, very different than the way people speak about these sites 10 or 15 years ago. Treating these sites and their associated communities with dignity is a really simple thing. But unfortunately, in both cases, respect for the site and respect for the descendant communities had to be fought for. And it was fought for, and it continues to be fought for. And when some of, especially, back when we were really kind of in the midst of this fight to get Walter Pierce recognized, some of the more inflexible members of archaeology's old guard, they really wanted smoke. And, my predecessors gave them fire when they wanted smoke because they dug in and believed that these sites deserve to be fought for and deserve their dignity. So the significance of Walter Pierce project is that, from New York to Florida to Texas and beyond, African American cemeteries have struggled. African American communities have struggled to preserve these cemeteries. And African American cemeteries in particular are vulnerable to a host of issues. They are vulnerable to land acquisition by developers. They are vulnerable to disrepair because economically strapped neighborhoods cannot always maintain them on their own. These cemeteries are particularly vulnerable to abandonment because elders pass away and their descendants migrate maybe to larger cities or different areas. And they are also vulnerable to obscurity because some of them originally did not have large or very distinct headstones or markers. And so finally, I just wanted to point out, something I felt was really interesting about these communities and the people buried in this cemetery. So we saw that they came from a lot of different places, but in addition to coming from all over, the South, we also see people who have roots from much further away. So I know you can't read these, but the first death certificate, the deceased parents were born in Africa. She mentions that both of her parents were born in Africa. In the middle death certificate, this person had parents who were born in Chile. And on the last death certificate, it was just, the man was very specific about the fact that he was born in Morgan City, Georgia. So I think that this site and this community tells the story of African Americans in the nation's capital in a very extraordinary way. And I think these roots have to be continually recognized and celebrated. And so right now, archaeology is moving more towards archaeological heritage as a human right. History lives, the past is present, and burial protection is a human right. So as a Black woman archaeologist, I find myself in spaces where certain archaeologists are unwilling to recognize the rights of descendant communities. NAGPRA, the Native American Grave Repatriations Act, has changed the language around some of these issues, but the legal language is not always applied to other marginalized groups. But now we have larger organizations like Society for Black Archaeologists and Blacks in Bioanth, BIBA. And so now there is kind of a concentration of Black archaeologists and anthropologists who are committed to these communities. And so now the conversation will change because we have the numbers and we have the commitment and we have the support to celebrate and continue to fight for the dignity of these spaces. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andre Ferrell. Thank you, Dr. Shayla, for your commentary and just your experience with the Walter Pierce Park. I am coming to share the viewpoint of a descendant who has always known that he has had a long line of DC connections, but just didn't know how much. So just give me a moment to share my screen and get things underway. So again, the descendants that are in that were interred at the Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery were two members of my Johnson family, and they were my fourth great grandparents, Philip and Clara Johnson. And so Philip and Clara came from Virginia, at least based on the paperwork that I have seen. And I represent one of thousands of descendants who are walking through this journey of figuring out where they've come from. And so the Johnson family, as I have researched, came from Virginia, and I was researching my third great grandparents, who are seen on the far left-hand side, Ferrell and Louisa Johnson. They came from Virginia as a family, and as you see, there are quite a few siblings, and they came with their parents, his parents, I should say. And so in researching my Johnson line, I see this record in the 1870 census for a Philip and Clara Johnson. And so, Philip and Clara are noted as coming from Virginia. I have other documentation that may suggest that Clara was born in Maryland. And I say came from because I also look at this side of my family as having been enslaved, and I will explain the logic in a short moment. But they were in Washington, D.C. as of 1870 and even earlier. And so this is my maternal line. So I look at my mother as being fifth generation Native Washingtonian, which is a very hard statement that for folks to make in this current climate where there doesn't seem to be a lot of, quote, Native Washingtonians. But you'll see here in the 1870 census, in a household, it is Philip and Clara. Philip is listed as a carpenter, and Clara is listed as a laundress. There are also Burrell and his wife and his three children that were born at the time, Ellen, Anna, and Alberta. And then there were several other siblings of Burrell: Lucy, Julia, Smith, James, and either Herbie or Hertie. And so, again, this is just a family unit who have made their way north from Virginia. So my connection to the Mount Pleasant Cemetery came as, well, who were Philip and Clara? Can I find any type of additional information, i.e., any death certificates? And so, thankfully, through research, I was able to obtain copies of death certificates. And this is when I discover Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery. But before I get to that, probably the best notation that I can say about these death certificates pertain to Clara. Clara died first in 1874. And in this notation, she is listed as the wife of Philip Johnson. And anyone who is doing genealogical work knows that trying to trace a female line can be very challenging, because if you don't know a married name or potential relationship, so if there are no next of kin that you are researching, to determine if that person is the correct line or correct person can be very difficult. And so just the sheer fact that the family or the undertaker, whomever was writing this particular death certificate for her, noted her as the wife of Philip Johnson. And so as I was researching both Philip and Claire, I was just astonished at just some of the notations. And so as I was reviewing this notations, I saw that there's this Mount Pleasant Cemetery. And Dr. Shayla has highlighted the fact that there are other cemeteries, Black cemeteries, and Mary has highlighted situations of Black cemeteries in particular where they have been paved over or just not cared for. And through my own research, I have descendants, ancestors buried at the Woodlawn Cemetery in Northeast. I also have descendants that were buried at Harmony, which no longer exists in the DC location, and their graves were reinterred in Prince George's County. I also have members of my family that were buried at Payne, and Payne no longer exists, and that was paid over, and I think it's like a rec center and a school and some other elements. And so just the notion of this site was sites have been desecrated and there's no regard for ancestral burial sites is a tragedy. And so I'm looking at Mount Pleasant, and I'm not familiar with Mount Pleasant. I had never heard of Mount Pleasant as part of my own genealogical research. And so you go to the source that keeps on giving, and you go to Google. And so I found an article in 2014. So I'm researching this in 2014. I see an article that had just came out a year prior in the Washington Post about graves at an Adams Morgan Park area. And so this is my first coming to knowledge of the Walter Pierce Park and the fact that this park is the site of the Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery. And so through a continuing looking at Google and research, I find that there's a website for the Walter Pierce Park work, and I contact Mary. And so around 2014, 2015 is how I met Mary and came into knowledge and understanding of the park in its current state, as well as the history of the Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery. And so just for reference, as it relates to my ancestors, as you will see on the far left, is an indicator of where the cemetery was. And so my ancestors were essentially members of the community. Clara, at the time, the Johnson family lived on Boundary Street, which is now Florida Avenue for those of a reference point, between 16th and 17th Streets Northwest. And then a few years later, when Philip dies in 1879, the family is living on P Street between 17th and 18th Street. Again, Philip was a carpenter. At least that's what is noted in the census. So there is a certain level of means to be able to afford a burial and being able to have he and his wife to be interred at this Black-owned cemetery, because the other cemeteries are literally across town. And so this is a nearby cemetery in this part of Northwest Washington. And so just being able to speak to what they were able to do concerning their afterlife, I found to be very special and very important. And so as a result of meeting Mary, she highlighted some events. And one of the events that I had the opportunity to participate is Say Their Name. And Say Their Name event is an activity by which we are sharing and speaking out the names of the over 8,000 interred at the Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery. And there's a group of individuals, some who are descendants of the interred, who are just calling out the names of the ancestors. And these are names that should never be forgotten. And so it's a beautiful observation and recognition of those who have preceded us and those who are continuing to guide us as we are going through our own lives, and in some cases as we are digging up the graves and digging up the names. And so I am grateful for the work that Mary and Shayla have done in allowing me just an opportunity to find, oh, well, not only here is where the park is and where the cemetery was, but that there were people who cared and have taken a very active role in caring for the preservation of the piece of land that still is considered the Walter Pierce Park. And so I share this as I'm highlighting just kind of like my connection to Philip and Claire. They were my fourth great grandparents, and I never heard these stories. Unfortunately, through the generations, the story gets lost. And I am grateful that I can at least start sharing some pieces of what I have learned thus far about my Johnson line. There's still more to do, of course, but to know that that my family goes to 1864, roughly. And so we're looking at a family that came during the time of the Civil War. And I would assume, just based on the time frame, escaping from slavery, freed during some battle, part of a contraband camp before establishing themselves. And so these are pieces that I'm continuing to research, but just to know that they stayed in Washington and they made a life for themselves. And even to time of my mother's birth, they were living in the Mount Pleasant area, which is literally a few miles off from where the Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery was. And so just having that connection to the family is very deep and very spiritual and just very important to highlight as part of just the story and the narration that I'm sharing. And so it has been a pleasure in just sharing with you just two people who are interred at the Mount Pleasant Plains Cemetery. It's been an honor to continue just to support however I'm able to the work that Mary has been doing for over 10, 15 years at this point, because it is a work that if it weren't for her, I may not have been able to find this information. I may not have been able to tangibly walk on the soil that my ancestors have been interred in. And so I am grateful for just this opportunity to be able to share and be a part of this panel. And so thank you all so much. And I will turn this presentation back to our moderator, Shay.
Thanks, Andre, and thanks, Mary and Shayla as well for sharing. I know it's emotional for all of you to be back together and get to interact today. And so I will look at our questions. If you have a question, you can put it into the Q&A box. And I know Zach will give us questions from Facebook if you've put them on Facebook as well. But I think my question is, moving forward with this work, like, what do each of you, like, if you had one final thing to say about, how important this work is and moving forward, what, DC community members can do to potentially support this project, like, what would you want people to know?
I guess I'll go first. It's good to be very concrete about what you want. And I would like to see the DC Department of Parks and Recreation make good on its promise for a memorial space. The descendants worked months in consultation with academics and community members, concerned community members, to arrive at a very modest plan to contain all the names of everyone buried at the cemetery. So that it was a reminder, it not only allows descendants to come and find their ancestors there, but it reminds anyone walking through the park or working in the park that there are graves there. And that's my concrete wish. I'm gratified to get to see Shayla again. We spent many hours together, and I'm deeply touched by Andre's presentation. It just makes the 17 years that we've spent at the park seem like an instant in terms of how it uplifts us. So thank you to both of you. And thanks to you, Shay.
I think if I could see one thing come out of this, ideally, in a perfect world, I would like to see descendant communities of African descent be treated as primary stakeholders with dignity and respect. I want that to become the norm. But if that does not become the norm based on an internal sense of ethics, then I support efforts by Society for Black Archaeologists and allies to actually codify into law respect for Black descendant communities and African American heritage sites and burial places. If people won't do the right thing, from an internal motivation, then I support providing legal motivation to do so.
From my vantage point, it's being able to have folks acknowledge and find. African American genealogy is already challenging as is, because there are points where you will not find records. And being able to find a record is one thing, but it's also something special to be able to walk on the land. And so for me, it's for the communities to acknowledge that these lands are sacred and that they deserve a measure of respect, because we're hearing too many stories of Black cemeteries in particular still continuing to be desecrated because of the effects of gentrification and development, because they don't care. And so piggybacking from Shayla as far as legal action, if that means figuring out a way to making sites historical landmarks, then that's what needs to be done. And for that to be successful, it requires people of descendants to be aware, one, that they have ancestors buried there, but then also wanting to take an active role as best as they can to respond to inquiries, to write a letter, to do the phone call, and whatever it requires, just so that those individuals who are interred can still rest in peace. And that's really the biggest thing. There's too much going on that folks shifting bones from one place to another. It's, for some that will be sacrilege. And so it's acknowledgement that we can touch this is a beautiful thing, and being able to call it historical will be even better.
That's great. We have two other questions as well. This is an anonymous question. Do we know how many burial grounds throughout the district have been paved over? I've heard about Columbia and Harmony and the Red Line, but not sure how many other ones there are. So if you don't know the exact answer to that question, that's totally fine. But yeah, I guess any information about paved over cemeteries in the district.
I know that the late, great Paul Sluby documented the burial grounds, the Black burial grounds of Washington, and wrote a whole book about it. I haven't read it recently, so I can't give you the number off the top of my head. But one day, a friend of mine and I did a sort of strange tour of the city and tried to find many of those sites. And literally, the Payne Cemetery that Andre mentioned, that is now a schoolyard. One cemetery, I think it was Moore's that we were looking for. It is, it's under a parking lot of a high rise. I don't know, it's just sad. So, you know, I don't have a number to put to it, but I recommend Paul Sluby's work if you can get a hold of the book. I'd also like to mention that the National Park Service right now is working, we have the site designated as a National Underground Railroad site for its obvious connections to freedom seekers. And there's also the fact of it being written up by the National Park Service right now, and I don't envy them the job, because writing a historic register nomination is an art in itself, but they're working on getting it on the National Register of Historic Places, which will protect it more. But it really comes down to the folks who show up at the park to do construction work or to community garden. We had to chase away community gardeners in the middle of our archaeological survey, which is just crazy. And people still sometimes ask me, can we ever go back to community gardening? And I always make some flippant statement in response, but you know, it's just beyond me why people don't get it. So.
And I don't think it's beyond me at all, because I mean, if I'm just going to be honest, and I've gotten to that point where I don't see the point of not being honest, some of this is anti-Blackness. And if I don't think that people would be as eager to grow some corn on top of people who are not African American, you know, I mean, because the thing about it is, if you said that those people were Potomac or something else, if you said that they were Native American, certain people who were determined to grow corn on top of Black people would not be growing corn at that moment. So I do think that, unfortunately, you know, maybe it's my job as an anthropologist to bring it up, but we have to examine at least the role of anti-Blackness and how that translates to the treatment of the dead.
And I would add to that by saying DC is no longer a city of natives. There are, and native as in, you at least can trace your family back to at least a grandparent or a great grandparent. You know, so you're looking at 3-4 generations. You have a lot of folks who are new to DC in the last 20 years who are here for jobs, and it's a wonderful thing, but they lack the appreciation of and the history of the city. And so they will look at certain institutions, certain plots of land as, oh, I don't care about this because it's in my way. So I look at the church I was raised in. It is in historic Capitol Hill, a neighborhood that was historically Black for decades. Now it has totally changed, and every so often, at least before the pandemic, you know, there are conversations with neighbors about, well, do you have to park here? This church was here before you got here. And so there's just a lack of respect for those who have been here. And all they want to do is just preserve their existence like anyone else. And part of it is just, if you're from DC, your mom's from DC or grandparents from DC, you have a better appreciation for the city than someone who just moved here from a major metropolitan city.
And what I would hope is that part of being good neighbors, because, you know, there is this element of movement and demographic shifts that, you know, that we can't really stem that tide, but people can teach themselves to be good neighbors, and they can hold themselves to a standard of compassion and respect. So even as a newcomer, there are ways to be a newcomer. There are ways to move into these urban spaces and move with grace and compassion and respect for the communities that are there. And I think that that's what should be happening. When you know that you're coming into that space, hold yourself to a standard of compassion and respect.
All such great comments that I can't even add anything. We do have we have two questions that I'm going to combine for time reasons about the archival work that was completed with the project. So the first question that I'll add on the second one too is, can you elaborate on the research that you conducted at the DC Archives? And the second part of that question from our other questioner is, how did the differences in what existed in those records change your research process as an archaeologist and with interpreting artifacts? So elaborating on the research, and then how did what you found impact kind of the archaeological work that you were doing in your interpretation, if that makes sense. Try to combine them.
Would you like to answer, Shayla? Go ahead.
Well, I'll let Mary give the primary answer because, you know, she was actually in charge of it. But as an archaeologist, people's origins are important because we might not have necessarily known like how many states and how many regions these people had come from. So there is an essay that's included in the report where people were referring to the cemetery as a voodoo cemetery, and it's a fictional essay, and so we don't really know how accurate of a description that was. And this is years after the cemetery had ceased to be in active use. But what's interesting to me is the way that the communities around it are perceiving the concentrations of artifacts. So how are people in the district perceiving those caches and those stores and those clusters of ceramics and glass? How are they perceiving the funerary treatment and the material remains of those funerary displays and those funerary activities? And so for me, some of the insight into that comes from the birthplaces of some of those people born into them cemeteries. A lot of people buried in that cemetery were coming from places in the Deep South. So to me, as an archaeologist, that makes me step back. It makes me think about the interplay between African American Christianity and traditional African religions. And it makes me think that we don't know enough about how people were pulling together different strains and different ideologies to see the world, right? But it kind of makes me respect the fact that people are using materials to say something. They're using materials to express something in this funerary space, and seeing that they come from such a wide variety of locations. We just kind of have to respect that there was something syncretic and something very varied and creative with many sources that was, might have been happening there in that space and in that community. But Mary was the one who designed the archival work, so maybe she has a perspective on like what the approach was.
My approach, I'm not a scientist, but I'm a former journalist, so I know a little bit about investigating records. The only way that, as Shayla calls it, a descendant-centered survey can take place is if you know who is buried in the cemetery. And we may feel a cultural kinship to those people, but it's not until someone like Andre Ferrell finds his grandparents buried there that you can say we are a direct descendant of those people. So finding the names and whatever other information there was on the death certificates was, for me, the most important part of my work. So it was very straightforward. We just copied down every death certificate that said Mount Pleasant Plains. In some cases, it said Young Men's Burial Ground, which was a name that continued to be used to apply to Mount Pleasant Plains. So there was no change in our research plan because it was really straightforward. But I just think that anyone who is intent on learning about a cemetery or saving a cemetery, you've really got to try to figure out who was buried there. If you want to have descendants, if you want to serve the descendants correctly. It's not just about the headstones or the, you know, the pretty hills or, you know, you have to put a face on it. You have to put flesh on those bones. And so that was the whole idea behind it.
I would just add for you all that you all had great access to the DC archives to do that, because not everyone has a headstone. And so if it's not for potentially a death certificate or a notation in a periodical, in this case, it would have been the Evening Star of one of the many publications of the time, you know, that you wouldn't have been able to do what you've been able to do. And so, you know, I can't emphasize how grateful I am to the work that you and others did in spending multiple years searching in the DC archives. I think I see Bill Branch is on the call as well, and so I know you and him have gone way back to helping getting this list put together. So I can go onto your website, Walter Pierce Park Cemetery site, go to a spreadsheet and just do a key name search and verify.
Could I just add one thing? You mentioned Bill Branch. I wanted to mention that Bill Branch at the archives helped us, and Mr. Ali Rahman helped us tremendously. They would pull the boxes for us, and then we'd sit there. You saw the photos. But yes, the name of the website, if you want to see if you have ancestors buried there, or if you're researching a Black person who may have died between 1870 and 1890, the name of the website is Walter Pierce Park Cemeteries, plural, .org. Walter Pierce Park Cemeteries.org. And one of the important ethical lessons that Mark Mack taught us all was to do things in public and make things public. And so I maintain this website so that we have public access readily available, and all our reports are online. So I hope you go there, look for your ancestors. If you're a descendant, send me an email. I'd love to know about you because it makes our work meaningful. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a great place to wrap up. And the link is also in the chat if you want to go directly. And if you registered, I'll send out a follow-up email with links as well if you want direct access to the website and the report as well. And as usual, if you have any questions or follow-ups, or you want to be connected to any of our panelists, feel free to message us at DCPL. We're available through our social media accounts or our email, which is info@dcpreservation.org. So I think we will wrap it up. And I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you for all your wonderful comments, and big round of applause for our panelists. It was so great. And yeah, I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you.